Hello, everybody. Welcome to another video. Today is already the 12th of March, and once again, we're looking at the Kursk region as the Russian forces continue to advance and take over the vast majority of the Ukrainian holdings. We're going to look at the current frontline situation, including some new geolocations indicating really deep Russian consolidations and penetrations into villages that previously were pretty deep into the Ukrainian rear. We're going to look at the course of the battles and what's going to come up next in this region. We're going to look at other parts of the front line as well, along with the Ukrainian American talks in Saudi Arabia and the fact that now President Trump has announced that aid to Ukrainian intelligence has been resumed. And that all goes along with the ceasefire proposal. So we'll discuss that by the end of today's upload. But let's begin by looking at the updates from the line of contact. We have over here just corroboration of the Russian side getting control over some of the floodplains near the Psela River. You could see that over here. And just various open areas west of Plehovo, areas that really haven't been touched by either side that much. But now, due to the Ukrainians withdrawing from so many of their forward positions, the Russians simply had an opportunity with a pretty small garrison to take control over here of 9.4 square kilometers, meaning that the only thing separating the Russians from Plehovo to Guevo is the Psel River itself. Pretty narrow over here. Let's look at the actual width. It's only around 70 meters. And besides that, the Russian forces have some pretty strong positions that they've paved for themselves over the past couple of days just north of Guevo. And Guevo serves right now as one of Ukraine's most solid bases of organization in Kursk that still remains under their control to a certain degree right now. As we see with Sudzha, the Ukrainians really are in disarray over there and are in the process of withdrawing completely. And that process could actually be finished at a very fast pace at this point in time, given the geolocations we're seeing of Russians within the town, especially in the east. And over here in Guevo, it just sort of is more naturally connected to the rest of the Ukrainian holdings in Sumy because it isn't outstretched. It's not in any sort of like sticking out pockets in the same fashion that we see over here with Sudzha and with the rest of the pockets in villages that are running along the R200 highway, for instance, or nearby gullies. And so for now, the Russian forces have not made a decisive move to attack towards Gornal and Guevo, but that is definitely next on the chopping block, as that would give the Russian forces the impetus needed in order to, first of all, restore the borders from before the Ukrainian offensive started in August in 2024, and then also to give the Russians the opportunity to use it as a launch pad to begin attacking into Sumy Oblast itself, because right now the Russians, of course, have the momentum. Russian forces over here are roughly at 70,000 men. I didn't do the same sort of calculation, nitty gritty calculation that I did for the Ukrainian side, where I actually went through each individual unit on the Ukrainian order of battle and I counted like how many men they had and then added it up. Because when I did that, I got to around 40,000 men for the Ukrainian order of battle over here. And then the Russian strength, based on Ukrainian estimates and just what appears to be fitting to me based on the amount of divisions and brigades deployed over here, it's also probably around 70,000. So the Russians do have a pretty notable advantage when it comes to manpower. And we could see that really be used in order to help continue with offensive activity, given the fact that Russian attrition rates have not been that high over the past week because a lot of the movement has not involved clashes. The Ukrainians have just been constantly on the retreat. So the Russians haven't really had to fight hard for every single square kilometer of territory. They're really just zooming through a lot of these settlements, raising flags without having to die over them, meaning that they have the offensive capacity to then fight over in a more difficult terrain and more difficult conditions for villages that are just across the border into Sumy itself. And doing so through Guevo Gornal would reach areas like Mohoritsia, which used to act as a conduit between the Sumy rear and Kursk Oblast, and now is getting increasingly closer to the front line. So that's something to keep in mind as we move forward, and we will discuss that possibility in future videos this week. But as we look at the relevant updates from today, you'll see that the Russian side has been able to capture 51 square kilometers of territory, just an insane amount when you compare it to the slogfest that really ensued in Kursk for a long period of time. But really, when you look at the course of the battles in Kursk ever since, say, November and December of 2024, it was all leading up to this point. And I was making that observation even at the time when it came to the dynamics of where the Russians were attacking, why they were putting so much emphasis on certain regions, and why it looked like they were hitting a wall at certain portions in time and really were achieving minimal gains. all of it was a part of chipping away at the Ukrainian flanks in areas that became increasingly narrow. And of course, that led to high attrition rates. Of course, the pace was very slow at first, but you can see that once a breakthrough was achieved, the pace at which really additional achievements really was ensued increased substantially and exponentially, actually. And now you could see that manifest on the battlefield. So Russian forces have captured Mikhailovka, Mirny. Most of it is under Russian control. There's a bit of ambiguity about some of the westernmost houses in Mirny that are pretty close to the river, the Sudzha River, and then that's actually when you reach the city itself. So that region, we still aren't fully aware of the Russian presence over there, although it's pretty clear that they are eventually going to reach there if they haven't already. And in all likelihood, they have already arrived and they just haven't published geolocated footage yet. But we do have some footage of them in this sort of empty portion of Mirny that is pretty close to actually being within Sudzha's boundaries. And so Russian soldiers are already walking through over here, largely from the 11th VDV Brigade, and they're showing the damage. Honestly, the damage over here isn't that significant, and that's a factor. It's really just pointing out the fact that there weren't intense urban clashes for that long in this part of Sudzha and Mirny, because the Ukrainians took it over rather quickly and now the Russians took it back rather quickly. So most of the damage is from shelling or from Russian individual strikes onto Ukrainian convoys and soldiers that were stationed around here. So you can see how it really just looks like a ghost town right now because there is a zero Ukrainian presence. There were Ukrainian soldiers, though, filmed over here on March 11th. 12 Ukrainian soldiers recorded by a Russian reconnaissance drone as they were withdrawing from Sudzha. And so Russian artillery and FPV drones, of course, were very active over the past 24 hours, spotting those individual Ukrainian soldiers and whatever vehicles they are using. And they're not using heavy vehicles. Maybe they're using 4x4s or just private residential, or not residential, but private vehicles, civilian vehicles to withdraw. But anything in terms of tanks or heavier armored fighting vehicles, a lot of them have just been abandoned right now, especially along the R200 road. Russian soldiers that already advanced in areas near Martinovka, they're already releasing footage of the, disheveled, I suppose, interior of some of these vehicles that were disabled and then left abandoned. So you're going to see a lot of that as the Russians get closer to taking over the entire span of the R200 highway, because a large majority of the vehicular damage occurred in the border region between Sumy and Kursk, which the Russians have not arrived at yet, but they are approaching it at this pace. We also know that beginning with the March 8th Russian breakthrough, the Ukrainian forces were looking to immediately withdraw from some of their outstretched positions after they understood that the Russians in the gas pipeline were able to set up a defensive perimeter and establish contact with the larger Russian garrisons from 11th VDV Brigade, from Ahmad Aida Special Forces, from 30th Motorized Rifle Regiment, and various other units that were involved in the operation. And so they wanted to very quickly withdraw with armored vehicles, but the Russian forces planned everything and really were able to implement it in a rather really good way from their perspective, you could say, because there were four bridges that were destroyed in the build-up to the operation, the gas pipeline operation. I'll just click on a few of them. There's one over here that we discussed in an earlier video, but these are obviously critical for Ukrainian logistics and for a smooth Ukrainian retreat. And you can see over here, for instance, that there were a couple of bridges across the Reka Sudzha directly into Sudzha itself from Mirny. There were a couple that are just to the north near the Kasachaya Lokanaya region, and all of them were destroyed in the buildup either by FPV drones that targeted the underside of the bridge, the pillars holding it up, or actual fabs like Fab 3000s being utilized to cause as much explosive damage as possible, destroy the infrastructure of the span of the bridge. And so four of them were destroyed in total, and those were the ones needed for Ukrainian soldiers that had vehicles east of rivers that aren't even that wide, but they still need to have a means by which to traverse them. And so a lot of vehicles thereby were abandoned and troops had to cross over on foot. And we see over here, for instance, a video from the Sudzha border crossing. This is from March 10th of 11 Ukrainian soldiers withdrawing from Kursk, never to return. And so you could see over here that have moved all the Ukrainian units out of Kursk. Say there may be a couple hundred left that are pretty close to the border near gullies or near some of the basements in villages like Olashina, Gogolevka, even maybe Rubenshina. But even that's a bit of a stretch right now. Ukrainian forces on foot are largely the ones withdrawing out of populated areas in Sudzha and Goncharovka, and we'll have to see when the Russians actually release footage from there. And then also from Guevo and Gornal, the Ukrainian forces that were originally deployed there from 129th Territorial Defense Brigade and from the Array Battalion. There's no indication of them leaving yet, so we could say there may be a couple hundred Ukrainian soldiers left within the boundaries of Kursk itself as the Russians continue to close in on the remaining 170 square kilometers of territory that nominally I have marked as under Ukrainian control. Just to further summarize, the Russian forces were able to advance from the southern direction and really get to a deep penetration, achieve an advance of nearly 4 kilometers northwards. They raised their flag in Zamoste, and this is from March 11th. It was atop a church that's pretty close to the Sudzha city center. They took over various other smaller villages like Makhnovka, Dmitriukov, Komakov, the entirety of Cherkasskaya Konopelka. Over here, Bondarivka, there's proof of this. There's the 11th VDV Brigade capturing it and raising their flags and just clearing out Ukrainian positions, Agronome, and also Mikhailovka. So, really, the list goes on. It's a substantial amount. And same thing occurred a bit to the north of Sudzha over here with the capture of 85 square kilometers of territory. Russian forces were able to capture Nikolsky, Loknaya, Yuzhny Pravda, Ivashkovsky, over here Zazulevka, Kubatkin, and Kazachaya Loknaya, and Bogdanovka. So that's also a non-trivial amount of territory just in terms of square kilometers, and then also the villages, the populated areas that were taken back. In addition to that, means that the front line has really been able to gulp up the entirety of this Ukrainian outstretched pocket that previously spanned all the way up north to Pogrebki. We can see how quickly the Russians have been able to enter into these regions, a lot of it being conducted by Chechen special forces. So, for instance, in the Zazulevka region, it was actually Apti Alaudinov, who filmed himself, and that was on March 10th. And it's actually very interesting that a major general like that and a high-ranking official within the Akhmat structure was able to reach the front line at such a sort of new time, because at the time, March 10th, the Russians had just entered into the village, and you already had a high-ranking official recording himself there, indicating that the Ukrainian presence really had dissipated really quickly from that location. But that gave us the proof that the Russian forces entered in 2 days ago. Russian forces, they maneuvered both from the south, from the landing of the pipeline garrison, which apparently, according to an ex-Wagner general who was interviewed on the matter, said that there were 800 Russian soldiers involved. So they would have advanced north with reinforcements to arrive at Kubatkin. And at the same time, they had an adjacent attack from the same garrison that was involved in the capture of Malaya Luknaya, and then advanced along the rail line southwards. And so, with those two vectors, any Ukrainian soldiers in between were forced to immediately withdraw, and thereby allowed the Russians to siege a huge chunk of territory in a very small window of time. So, to elaborate on what the Wagner general said in the interview, he said that there were actually 3 weeks of preparation for the pipeline operation, which is understandable because we could see how Russian airstrikes and artillery was coordinated in such a way to clear out certain locations north of Sudzha in order to pave the infrastructure for such an attack. But besides that, you also had a operation that involved constant supply of food, water, ammunition for the soldiers that were advancing along the pipeline, which now is purported to be 800. It's possible they didn't attack at the same time in unison with 800 soldiers, because we didn't see anything close to that in the footage released by the Ukrainian side. We saw smaller groups. So it could be that there was a vanguard of 100 and then additional hundreds entered in and got out of the pipeline later on in the day. And that was March 8th, I believe. But regardless of that fact, numerous companies of Russian soldiers were involved in the operation, and they also had to wait 4 days within the pipelines and then advance for another 2 days just walking on foot. So they were there for nearly a week. Beforehand, there was a pumping operation to remove some of the gas because obviously it can be deadly. They try to pump in air, pump in some oxygen in order to prevent methane poisoning, but apparently a large amount of the Russian soldiers that were involved that survived, they got methane poisoning, which is understandable when you're in such conditions for basically a week. So with all of that being said, the Russian forces have been able to take out this conduit which previously was considered to be a really important intermediary point between Sudzha and, say, locations near the border crossings, and then the front line that we all knew for a very long time, for numerous months. And everything passed through the positions and the roads and the couple of bridges in Kazachaya, Luknaya. Now it's been taken over really quickly by the Russian side without any Ukrainian resistance. As the Ukrainians withdrew, the Russians were just incessantly bombarding them. Over here, you can see a video of the Akhmat special forces as they were involved in capturing that village. And now this is the front line that I'm utilizing, basically running along one of the river plains, a bit to the west and a bit to the east of the village. But understandably, the Russians now have the opportunity to continue advancing southwards, reach other hamlets like Kniazhi, and then from there reach the ring road that is a bit to the northwest of Sudzha. And then from there, you arrive at the R200 road, flanking whatever is left of the Ukrainian vestiges in Sudzha and populated areas. And then from there, it's not much of a drive to arrive at the border. It's about 10 kilometers away at the border crossing between Sumy and Kursk. So the Russians are in this consolidation phase, which could take a couple of days to complete in its entirety. Ukrainian forces, when it comes to attrition rates, you would say that high casualties were suffered during these withdrawals, understandably. From a vehicular perspective, that is the case. Also, from a manpower perspective, but not many POWs taken because the Ukrainians were not completely encircled. I have to make that clear. The Ukrainians were not fully cut off in most cases. Individual squads may have been cut off, and that always happens in these sort of hectic withdrawals. But large company size or battalion size formations were not cut off in these assaults, and they were able to disperse on foot or in private vehicles to get out beforehand. But as they were doing so, they were definitely struck by the Russian side in open terrain, utilizing a vast array of firepower. As there were plenty of Iskander strikes destroying vehicles and of course, adjacent convoys. Large scale artillery strikes, firms, fire map shows that there were just a crazy amount of fires all around the plains and the open fields west of Sudzha, where Ukrainian forces were moving back and forth. And that would definitely indicate that there were high casualties in that movement. And then the FPV crews. Russians have pioneered some of the best FPV strategies and some of the best forces that the Russians have that are drone operators are operating in Kursk. Their experience could be used to then attack deeper into Sumy, but they can also be deployed elsewhere to other parts of the front line to further improve the efficacy of Russia's drone program, whether it be from the Rubicon group, which has displayed a lot of acumen when it comes to striking Ukrainian vehicles and striking convoys in general, overwhelming their ability to absorb firepower, to absorb explosives that attack them, targeting Russian, or I should say Ukrainian installations throughout the entirety of the day using both regular FPVs and fiber optics, hitting them at night as well. So there were a lot of thermal FPV strikes that were released by this unit. So all of that played a role in further hampering Ukraine's logistics and will continue to do so because even now the Ukrainians are relying on the same road, the R200, to supply the front line along the border. So once the Russians are able to consolidate control over the remaining 170 square kilometers and the fighting does shift to locations over here near Yanikivka, Sadki, because that will eventually just be a natural extension or corollary of the Russian attacks right now and their momentum as they're advancing throughout all of Kursk. The same issues will still remain for the Ukrainian vehicles and forces that try to resupply the current garrison that is trying to maintain control over the border. Because right now it's Ukraine's highest priority. They do have a large grouping over here that doesn't have to cover as much of a perimeter right now because they're not fighting on an outstretched pocket that has all of these various salients. They're just fighting on a solid front line that is pretty linear in some cases. I would say that it's more so diagonal, but still there aren't that many indentations. And so it's easier for a smaller force to defend in such a scenario, especially on their own territory. But nonetheless, the Ukrainian defenses here are not really well built. And that's something that I find to be crazy because the Ukrainians probably should have had the foresight to begin building defenses immediately after they launched the Kursk operation. Because, of course, given the fact that they were able to penetrate so deep into Kursk, they would be able to sort of push back the Russian firepower and divert its focus to actually engaging with the battles instead of targeting the rear. And then the Ukrainian sappers and engineers would have the ability to just build up a massive network of defenses along the border. And there has been some work that I have not showing on this map that I have to export And of course, I'll give credit to the people that were involved in curating the map and basically mapping out where the anti-tank ditches are, where the trenches are. I just haven't done it yet, but even with the Ukrainian work, it's nowhere near enough given the fact that there is now the northern group of forces that are partially deployed over here, partial deployment of two VDV divisions, and as we said, 70,000 people. Some of them may be moved back now to other parts of the front line because a lot of elements from Zaporozhye, Chasiv Yar, even to a certain degree from Toretsk, but even from Pokrovsk to a lesser degree, but I would say for the most part from Chasiv Yar, they were moved away from their, I suppose, command headquarters, and now they can be returned. And we're talking about several thousand at least forces that could be returned right now as a result of that. And that could actually change the course of battles in an area like Chasiv Yar, but they could also stay over here and play a significant role in continuing with the Russian achievements and Russian advances into Sumy Oblast itself, because at the end of the day, the only difference is now that there is the Russian anti-tank ditch that is separating the border. There's some Ukrainian defenses, but besides that, it is just an arbitrary line when all things are considered from a battlefield perspective. Now, when we're looking at other parts of the line of contact, I wanted to just mention that the Ukrainians have been able to reestablish control over the northern flank of Kupiansk. So, this has not happened in just a single episode or in one night. It happened over months, and I just was not able to find proof or cover it because it was sort of a bit more irrelevant in comparison to other advances. But I really should be mentioning it. Ukrainians were able to take back 17.4 square kilometers and repel the Russian infiltration that could have led to the collapse of Kupiansk. So it's very important that the Ukrainians did this, and that there's now a solid line of defense essentially south of Sinkivka, with western Sinkivka actually falling into a gray zone now. This is really a part of the Ukrainians actually redeploying and rejuvenating their force composition over here, because now the 30th Mechanized Brigade is only partially located in Kupiansk, with a lot of the forces involved with that unit fighting in the Seversk front. Now you also have the 114th Territorial Defense Brigade, which previously was on the rear for a very long time in reserve and not really get involved in heavy fighting. Now it's been deployed over here with whatever new recruits it received from the Territorial Defense Pool, and they're also operating with the very experienced 14th Mechanized Brigade that's been deployed east of Kupiansk for years now. I haven't seen them been moved; they haven't been moved away once from their designated part of the front line, which is in contrast to a lot of these other units that have been shuffled around numerous times, like 43rd Mechanized Brigade, 116th, 115th. But now all of them are trying to protect the eastern approaches into Kupiansk as well. Just to look at the situation around Seversk, you can see a bit of a advance by the Russian side, 2.6 square kilometers of territory captured. As I've been saying, the Russians over here really are trying to chip away at open fields that overlook Seversk to the northeast. I sound like a broken record, but it's true. That's what they're trying to do over here. That's why they're attacking in a northern direction. Even though there aren't many populated areas over here, they're trying to dislodge Ukrainians from heights. And that's why you have the operational tactical grouping of Luhansk that is working in unison, and they've been able to repel some of the larger Russian assaults and prevent them from infiltrating deeper. In this case, the Ukrainian grouping destroyed 14 armored fighting vehicles. I believe they damaged 16 of them. They destroyed one tank, and I think they damaged 10 as well. They also destroyed a couple of buggies and ATVs throughout the course of the fighting. So this is an area where actually we're seeing an uptick in Russian armored assaults. There was a phenomenon in Toretsk, for instance, where we saw barely any Russian armored assaults with, you know, a tank at the front and then MTLBs or BMPs or BMDs all deployed. We usually saw vans being used or private vehicles, and very rarely did we see armored vehicles. And then it led to discussions about potential shortages. Over here, we can see that the Russian forces are really diverting and putting in a lot of resources into armored assaults in an area where they view it as necessary from a tactical standpoint, and they believe could actually help them achieve a deep breakthrough. Perhaps they want to dismount forces into a tree line or to a local trench and then permanently dislodge the Ukrainians from that location. Right now, the Ukrainians over here consist of the 30th Mechanized Brigade, as we said, but I believe only a battalion or two. 81st Air Assault Brigade, 54th Mechanized Brigade, which is also floating around here, and recently added in the 118th Territorial Defense Brigade. They've also been deployed to this location. Perhaps also the 27th Infantry Brigade, but I don't have enough knowledge about their status right now. So I believe The final update from the front line we have is over here from the front line south of the highway, as I refer to it. You have the T-0504 highway that connects between Konstantinivka, Subyurno and Pokrovsk. It's an area that the Ukrainians have reinforced in order to prevent the Russians from establishing a wedge, not just physically a wedge across the highway, because by now it is so close that it's not being used anymore by the Ukrainians for transports, but also in order to give the Russians this sort of forward position that dominates the front line and overlooks numerous positions westwards into Myrnihad itself, and then also into a lot of the secondary routes that are being used to coordinate between the rear and Pokrovsk and front line in regions that are deeper and deeper eastwards, like Chasiv, like Turetsk right now, like Konstantinivka, which is sort of feeding both of those urban battles right now. So as we zoom in over here, the Russian forces were able to capture 4.5 square kilometers amidst the redeployment of Ukraine's 157th Mechanized Brigade from the Andriivka region. It's now involved with defensive activities over here. But nonetheless, Russian forces, they released a video of them clearing out this southern parts of Tarasivka. They were able to, identify individual Ukrainian groupings in basements and houses, striking them with FPV drones and grenade drops, and then also send in sappers to undermine the houses where they were hiding in and cause them to retreat or to just point blank shoot at them. And so that's the state of fighting over here as the Russians are trying to advance along this line of villages, along this low-lying river valley, and just try to get some additional outlets in order to cut off the T-0504 highway, because from this direct outlet that is just to the northwest of Vozdvizhenko, they were unable to do so. And now you have even further Ukrainian redeployments. The 1st Tank Brigade is now operating around here. I was always under the impression that they were fighting in Kursk, but it appears that recently they've been moved to fight over here, and they're involved with just ensuring that the Russians can't advance any further to the northwest. So just now a quick word on the potential ceasefire. So this was discussed by Rubio, the entire American delegation, Saudi Arabia, a proposal that Ukraine accepted actually of a 30-day ceasefire. And previously, the Ukrainians were looking for a ceasefire that would only include naval and aerial activity. And now they've actually changed their stance and are supportive of a 30-day ceasefire point blank. So there would be no fighting on the line of contact. It would just get completely frozen. So now, as a result of that, they're trying to goad Russia into a response, and the United States, they would like to see the Russian side acquiesce to that. And as sort of a reward and a return for what the Ukrainians agreed to, now you have the Trump administration unfreezing the military aid that, regardless, was supposed to be was slated to be sent to the Ukrainian side, because you have all these contracts, you have the Presidential Drawdown Authority, you have the DoD stockpiles, you have the funding mechanism for foreign nations through the State Department. There are various ways of funding Ukraine that have been passed through legislation, including the Ukraine Security Initiative. But I believe that that initiative, that pool of funding, is now completely dried up. So that's not a way to actually fund Ukraine. The way to do it is through the DoD stockpiles and through the State Department mechanism, which is what was done up until it was decided by the Trump administration and by State Department and Department of Defense officials to pause the funding. And so now that it's been resumed, those same avenues and channels will continue to send Ukraine aid, and you'll have all the contracts that were slated to, be given to American companies to ship weapons to Ukraine throughout the entirety of 2025. When it comes to Trump, though, he has $3 billion left in his presidential drawdown authority that he can use to help Ukraine attain further weaponry if he so desires, because so far he's not used that. But again, it's a pretty trivial amount in the grand scheme of things, $3 billion. And what we're seeing right now with the resumption of aid, it's important because it's the sustenance of the Ukrainians during a difficult time when they're conducting localized counterattacks in Pokrovsk, for instance, and they're involved with trying to stabilize the front line right now on the Sumy border. So it's something that they definitely need. And they would also have an interest in pausing the front line right now in where it's currently at for a period of a month in order to just get recuperation and regeneration for the 40,000 man garrison that was just involved in high intensity conflict in Kursk. The Ukrainians also are pleased by the fact that intelligence cooperation has completely resumed. So they're getting early warnings on Russian airstrikes and on Russian positions in Ukraine itself, and then also on the rear that are important for deep strikes. A lot of things that the Ukraine previously really did not imagine can be cut off in such a manner. Now they're going to have it back, but with certain stipulations that they've agreed to so far. And so, Russian officials that have discussed the matter, they have not dismissed outright the possibility of a ceasefire. They did not just out of hand reject it, which is important to note because it means that for the time being, Russia is actually considering it. And we'll have to see what route they end up taking, whether they genuinely will end up agreeing to a ceasefire, whether they try to negotiate better conditions, but actually are interested in such a ceasefire for a short period of time, or whether they are just completely opposed to the idea, but actually do want to improve relations and normalization with the Trump administration. And so they may just entertain it on surface level, but add in certain stipulations and try to drag out negotiations in order to sort of make it look like Ukraine's essentially the party that doesn't want to enact it. And then eventually they will just throw the entire idea under the bus and just continue with the war without any type of ceasefire. All those possibilities are true, but all that being said, even with a ceasefire, even if that were to end up becoming a reality, it would just be a drop in the bucket in the grand scheme of the war. And the war probably is going to continue with a natural course and won't end as a result of such ceasefires. We're going to have to look into those details in the future, but that's just my view. So feel free to discuss that in the comments if you agree or disagree. And so that's all for today. Thank you all so much for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.